And it turns out that in this company, individual division managers got to choose the price that they wanted to charge for insurance, for getting the high insurance plan over the low insurance plan. You automatically got the low insurance plan, but you could pay a little bit extra and get the high insurance plan. But these different managers were allowed to choose freely what they wanted to charge as prices. And now, of course, they could choose in a way that's correlated with what type of workers they have, but the assumption that Einov et al. Made, and who knows if it's exactly right, but was that these guys were just choosing pretty randomly what price they wanted to charge, right? If this was true, though, then that would let us see what that demand curve looks like, right? Because we can see, when you change those prices, what fraction of people choose the two plans, right? And we can, if we see the claims data, we can figure out what's the cost of insuring people at those different levels, right? So if the price was here and we got a certain quantity of people, we can then see what was the average cost of providing those people with insurance, and that will let us measure the average cost curve. And once we have the average cost curve, right, remember that from the slope of the average cost curve, we can get the difference between the average and the marginal cost. And so that lets us draw out the marginal cost curve once we have the average cost curve, right? So this is exactly what they did. So there were different managers who charged price here, price here, price here, price here. We saw how much quantity they got. That gives us these different data points. And then for each one of these data points, we could measure what the average cost of providing insurance was to those people. And that gives us this average cost curve. They then drew a linear curve through this. They drew a linear line through this. It looks a little bit more concave to me, but and then they drew out a marginal cost curve by taking the derivative of this average cost curve and using that to construct the difference between the average and marginal costs. And that allowed them to measure the cost of selection, right? The marginal cost of selection were the difference between the average and the marginal cost curve. And then using the demand curve, we can draw the Harberger triangle, just as in those pictures before. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this study, and about many similar studies, was that they found very small costs of selection. You see, this triangle here is really pretty small relative to the size of the market overall. Other studies actually found advantageous selection, so there might be too much insurance. But that was really sort of disappointing to some people, because they thought that, we have this whole theory about selection, and this is going to cause problem in insurance markets, and don't we have to worry about that? And that's sort of the basis of Obamacare in many ways, and all this stuff. And yet they were finding these very small adverse selection distortions, right? So one view that you could take is that if the adverse selection problem were really severe, we would expect to see market collapse, right? If we had such big selection that actually the cost curves were really decreasing, we could well end up in a case like this where the market fails to exist, right? And so we might actually be selectively looking at markets where selection is very small. Because in order for this whole approach to work, we need to have these positive quantities, and we need to sort of trace out this cost curve, right? But if the selection distortion is really severe, the market just won't exist at all, right? And that was a point made by Nathan Hendren in a 2011 paper. He was on the job market as an economist last year, and in fact, we made an offer to him at the University of Chicago, but he decided to go to Harvard, unfortunately. So he rejected our offer and instead took his studies of selective selection to Harvard. So what he did is he looked at markets where people can't get insurance at any price, right? So it turns out there's a lot of people like that. If you have various pre-existing conditions, if you have all other things, if you're above a certain age, people won't give you insurance, life insurance or health insurance at any price, right? And he wanted to figure out, is that because of selection, right? Because if that's because of selection, then maybe we're exactly looking at the markets where selection is very weak, right? And in the other markets, it might be much more severe. And so he did something very clever. He looked at surveys of people that were either able to get insurance or were not able to get insurance. And these surveys asked the people, what do you think the chances are that you end up getting hospitalized? What do you think the chances are that you end up dying of this, this, and that, right? And then he looked many years later at the actual health claims that those people made. And he regressed the health claims that the people made. He tried to predict those based on the people's own prediction of their own health. And that gave him a measure of how informed those people were about how sick they were likely to get, right? What he found was very interesting. He found that in the markets where people were unable to get insurance at any price, they both were able to predict very well how sick they would get in the future, and their expectations of how sick they would get were really spread out. Some people knew they were going to get really sick. Other people thought they weren't going to get sick. Other people knew they were going to be really healthy. Whereas in the markets where people could get insurance, people both weren't able to predict very well how sick they would get, and their predictions were very clustered together, right? And how does that relate to what we've been studying? Well, of course, if there are some people who really know they're going to get sick and other people who don't know they're going to get sick in a given category, then you know that the average cost is going to be way above the marginal cost. Whereas if they're close together, if people are clustered together, then the average person is going to be, who is going to buy insurance at a given price, is going to be very similar to the marginal person, right? And so here's an example. Here was the estimates that he got of how sick people were likely to be. So this is like, up here is the probability, is like how sick you end up getting, right? And you'll notice that, imagine I was to charge a price that just got this person to get into the market. Well, the marginal person is this sick. Their marginal cost is here. The average person is the average of this whole long thing. The average person is probably way up here. So if this person wanted to get insurance, they'd have to pay the price that this person would be willing to pay, and they might not be willing to do that. On the other hand, if you look at this market, this person is willing to pay this. The average person above them is probably only closer to here, right? They're not nearly as spread out. And so this person doesn't need to pay nearly as large of a premium on their premium, right, in order to get insurance. Because this is much more closely put together. When you look here, that's even more. The average person above, say, this level, right, is probably right there or something like that. Whereas for this guy, the average person above him is likely way up there. And so he found that, in fact, if you looked at every single market where you were, every single condition under which you were unable to get insurance, right? All those people would have to pay like a premium that was above 50% of what would be actuarially fair for that person. Actuarially fair is like what you'd be expected to have to pay. Whereas all the people who were able to get insurance had to pay a premium that was below 50%. And most of the people who couldn't get insurance were like 75, 80% premium. Most of the people who could get insurance were like 15, 20% premium, which is much more similar to what we saw in that picture from Econ. And so Hendren basically used that to show that the reason why we were finding such small adverse selection effects is that we were looking at markets that exist. And the markets where you can't get insurance at any price had really severe adverse selection. Okay. So the same types of approaches that we talked about for getting to full efficiency in the regulation case can be used in the insurance case to get down to marginal cost pricing. But they also have exactly the same set of problems, right? So first of all, imagine that we tried to give subsidies for insurance. Jacob, just using our analysis from before, what would be the problems with doing that?
I mean, you'd have to know what their actual costs are.
Yeah.
You might have companies losing money if
Yeah.
their marginal costs are decreasing and below their average costs.
Well, and you have to give subsidies, right?
Yeah, so that's where the subsidies come in.
Yeah.
What else?
Yes, you need to know like what the marginal person costs to insure, right? And not just at that point, like all throughout the market.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to know a whole lot about costs to figure out what the right subsidy is. Whereas the average cost, all you need to know is like the insurance data that they are getting, right? And there's also a danger of capture, therefore, because if the insurance companies know more about the marginal cost, and they're always going to try to persuade you that the marginal cost is really low, so you should give me a really big subsidy to, create a bigger market, right? A second policy you could use is you could mandate universal coverage. And in fact, that's been obviously something that's been big in the news recently. And Kevin, what could be the potential problem with mandating universal coverage?
Well, would this correspond to like the supply maybe being higher than what's socially optimal?
Yeah.
So I guess that would mean that there are people who we shouldn't insure socially.
So how could there be, I know that sounds a little funny, how could there be people who we shouldn't insure?
Well, because the social cost of insuring them, like they might be like so at risk, like they might be practically.
Yeah, but I mean the costs of it, but like the cost to them of paying for that is almost certainly greater than the cost to society of paying for that because they're risk averse, right? But what could be the cost of insurance? What could be the problem?
It's hard to identify those individuals, so raise prices for the rest of the.
Well, that's true, but still, that's sort of like that's just a transfer, right, between people. But what could be a problem with insuring people? What could be social loss from doing that? Israel?
I think there might be a moral hazard problem
Yeah.
if you insure everyone in the society.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So the problem is that, if people are, if everyone's getting insurance, right, then they might not take very good care of their health. Or they might go to a hospital that's really, really expensive because they don't have to pay for that extra bit, right? So insurance could create these moral hazard problems, and also there might just be administrative costs of running an insurance system. Yeah, Charlie.
What do you need to universal coverage though? Like you don't have moral hazard even when not everybody's covered.
Yeah, that's true. But it might be that some people have more moral hazard than other people do, right? And you might not want to cover those people who have particularly bad moral hazard and maybe aren't that risk averse, right? It's sort of like a competition between moral hazard and risk aversion, right? If you're really risk averse, then you want to give the person insurance. If you have low moral hazard, you want to give the person insurance. If they have high moral hazard but not very much risk aversion, you don't want to give them insurance. Right. Okay. So, what could be problems created by price discrimination here? What sort of price discrimination goes on in insurance markets usually? And what social problems could be created by that? Yeah.
The sort of standard is like for a healthy person, they get charged a lot less because they're less likely to get sick. But it's hard to know how likely it is that someone's going to get sick.
Yeah, that's an issue. What other, why do people usually not like that sort of discrimination? What is the usual objection that people give to that, like in the political discourse and so forth? Yeah, so what do you think, how could you phrase that in more economic terms? What do we mean by it's not fair?